Today we are going to talk about World War I. After war was declared, the European powers had to create their plans of action for the war. Germany created a plan called the Schlieffen Plan. This plan created a two-front war for Germany. The front in the east was against Russia and the front in the west was against France. Now initially they planned on not doing anything on the eastern front. They believed that it would take Russia way too long to get ready for war, and they could first focus on quickly defeating France and then worry about Russia. In order to get to France, though, Germany decided to pass through Belgium. With this decision, Great Britain immediately got involved on the French side of the war to assist in stopping the German forces. War did not happen as quickly as Germany had anticipated it going. In fact, although the Germans were able to push into France, most of the fighting in France then completely went to a stalemate because of the tactics that were being used. Trench warfare was a new war tactic that was used by all sides during the war. Trench warfare created very long, drawn-out, and very deadly battles. The way trench warfare worked is that a side would dig into the ground and use the holes that they've now dug as natural cover. Now, for an example of how long and deadly trench warfare could become, one of the main battles of the war, the First Battle of the Somme, lasted for over 4 months, and in that period there were over 1.2 million people either killed or injured, and that's just one battle of the war alone. As fighting was continuing throughout Europe, the United States remained neutral. The U.S. isolationist policy was created for a few reasons. We did not want to get involved in a European war that was so far from our own borders. In fact, it was over 3,000 miles away. On top of that, because of such a diverse population we had in the United States, there were many differing opinions within the country towards the war itself. Many immigrants still felt very loyal to their home countries, although they were now in America. And the U.S. government didn't want to risk any internal conflict by choosing a side in the war. But at the same time, we also had very close ties to the Allied side because of our history with Great Britain and because Britain and France were some of our largest importers of our goods. So economically speaking, we would benefit greatly by helping our allies win the war. Because we didn't want to create any conflict within the nation, we still remained neutral. However, we did benefit greatly from the war during the time that we were not involved. The war created an extreme boom in the United States economy. We were essentially one of the main powers that was not involved in war at the time, so we were a huge exporter of goods, whether that was supplies for the war, food, weapons, anything that was really needed. And so demand for all of those supplies created a huge labor shortage within the United States, but also created a huge economic boom within the United States, allowing for more people within the country to take advantage of this new economic status. As the war continued, American neutrality continued to fade. We couldn't stay out of the war. It was inevitable to get involved. However, our involvement was a very slow process. One of the first steps that really sparked the United States' interest and involvement in the war was the British blockade of Germany. The British Navy very early on decided to maintain a blockade of the German borders in order to prevent Germany from importing any supplies. Now, obviously, this was going to prove detrimental to the German economy, and it also kind of upset the United States because it was one less country to buy stuff from us. So, in response to the naval blockade, Germany declared a policy called unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare works exactly like it sounds. German submarines were going to attack any ship that they came across, regardless of type of ship it was. So any ship in the ocean that a German submarine would see, it promised that it would sink in order to try and negate that blockade. So any ship that was sailing through this time, whether it be for trade, travel, or naval purposes, was risking being attacked by a German U-boat, also known as a German submarine. One of the first events that really got the United States involved in the war was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. Although the RMS Lusitania was a British ship, there were American citizens on that ship. When the German U-boat came across the RMS Lusitania and shot a torpedo at it, the boat sunk and some American lives were lost. Although this angered the United States, it still wasn't enough to get the country involved in the war. We still maintained that neutrality policy. However, we wanted to ensure that we would be able to trade with other European nations, so we signed the Sussex Pledge with Germany, which was a promise to no longer sink passenger or trade ships and only focus on vessels that were labeled for the military. Almost immediately after signing this pledge, the Germans broke it and continued sinking all ships that they came in contact with. Again, not enough to get the United States involved in the war, however, enough to get the country and citizens within the country very angry at the actions that the Germans were taking. However, the straw that broke the camel's back on getting the United States involved in the war was the interception of the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was the note sent from Germany to Mexico to create an alliance between the two nations. This alliance would promise Mexico territory that was lost during the Mexican-American War. States like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona would be given back to Mexico at the end of World War I when Germany attacked the United States, hypothetically speaking. Germany promised to do this as long as Mexico would get immediately involved in World War I and try to influence the United States in getting involved on the German side. People within the country at this point were furious because you simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. And on top of that, many people in the country viewed this as a direct threat against the United States. So after the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, the United States declared war on Germany. The problem with the declaration of war on Germany was that although our economy was booming and we were producing rapid amounts of goods, our country as a whole was extremely unprepared to actually go fight in the war. In fact, at the time, our military consisted of only 200,000 men. So we definitely did not have the manpower to send people over to Europe to be fighting in this war. In order to quickly raise the size of the military, Woodrow Wilson passed an act called the Selective Service Act. The Selective Service Act created the draft system within the United States. It essentially has all men between the ages of 18 and 26, I believe, register with the U.S. government. This registration provides these young men a draft number. If that draft number is called, they are randomly selected to go to serve in the military. If the draft number is not called, they are able to stay home and not serve in the military. Initially, there was a lot of pushback against the Selective Service Act because many people believed they shouldn't be forced to joining into a war that they didn't actually believe in. Some of these individuals were called conscientious objectors. Conscientious objectors are people who are morally opposed to war, and they did not want to be a member of the draft and a member of the military if they would have to then go against their moral beliefs and go to war. However, ultimately, the Selective Service Act did exactly what it was intended on doing, because by the end of World War I, our military had grown from 200,000 men to over 4.8 million soldiers. In addition to growing the size of the military, we also needed to ensure domestically everyone in the country was in support of World War I. We couldn't have any internal conflicts while dealing with a war overseas in Europe. So two different organizations were created within the U.S. government. The first was called the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board was responsible for controlling production within the United States. It essentially told businesses what and how much to produce in order to ensure that people in the country had enough goods as well as people overseas had enough goods. In addition to the War Industries Board, the government also created the Committee on Public Information, also called the CPI. The CPI was essentially a propaganda machine. Their sole job, the only purpose of the CPI, was to inform and educate the public on the war. So what that meant for the United States was to keep people happy, keep them in support of our country and in support of our war. The CPI was responsible for some of the most famous propaganda campaigns in all of U.S. history, including the Uncle Sam, I Want You for the U.S. Army campaign. In addition to gaining support for the draft and the military, the CPI was also responsible for making sure American business was in support of the war as well, and producing goods that would assist in the war effort. All people throughout the country helped in some way, shape, or form towards the war effort. Women served unofficially still with the military as nurses, secretaries, and telephone operators. Many women even worked in factories while men were drafted to go out and fighting. Women were really the sole economic factor pushing the country forward throughout World War I. In addition to the role that many women played throughout the war, African Americans played a very large role in the war as well. African Americans were able to serve in the military in segregated units, and they made huge strides forward in desegregation of the military and allowing African Americans to serve in a more serious capacity. In addition to African Americans serving abroad, African Americans also served at home. Throughout World War I, there was a huge internal migration trend occurring called the Great Migration. This Great Migration was a huge movement of individuals from the South to the North. Many, and in fact most of those individuals were African Americans. The Great Migration was sparked by a need for economic opportunity and an escape from discrimination. Many African Americans took the war and used it to their advantage to gain economic status within the country with the huge amount of job opportunities that were opening in the northern factories as more and more men were going to war. In addition to that, many African Americans figured that if they'd moved north at a time where they were essentially guaranteed a job, they would also be faced with significantly less discrimination than they had been dealing with in the South. Many of the individuals who were serving at home in a way to assist the war effort did so in factories or in the shipyards. In the shipyards, we saw some of the most prevalent forms of mass production happening in American history. Shipyard workers were the only individuals who were exempt from the draft because the U.S. government felt that it was more important for individuals with that specific skill set to continue building boats and helping supply the Navy than it was to have them shipped off to war. So many workers in shipyards began to mass produce battleships that could be used for the war. They started to create standardized parts that were built in factories and then simply assemble ships in the shipyard rather than building boats from scratch. Many private shipyards were actually taken over by the government during World War I, and some commercial shipyards were as well, so that the government could gear them specifically towards the war effort. Now, one of the big problems plaguing the United States during the war was how to actually pay for all of these goods that were now being produced at such rapid rates, and how to pay the salaries of many of the people working in these factories. So in order to try and pay for the war, the U.S. government did two things. It increased income taxes for the first time since they had been initiated, and it sold war bonds, which were called Liberty and Victory bonds. Now, the increase in income tax at first was a little controversial. However, most people in the country were willing to pay a little more if it meant helping the men overseas. Liberty and Victory bonds that were sold were essentially IOUs from the American government. Individuals within the country would purchase this bond, which was essentially a piece of paper, for a specific amount, let's say $25. And the government guaranteed that once the war was over and after a specified period of time, individuals could then turn those bonds back into the government to receive their money back plus interest. So it would be worth more than that initial $25 that they had spent on it. Bonds were one of the most popular ways that the United States raised money for war in both World War I and in World War II. In addition to paying for the war, the United States throughout the entire involvement needed to ensure that, again, everyone was in support of the country. So one of the negative consequences of the United States being involved in the war was the extreme restrictions to people's First Amendment rights. There were a number of limitations placed on freedom of speech under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Both of these acts essentially outlawed any form of speech that was considered slanderous towards the United States or speaking out against any action that the United States government was undertaking during this time. Now, this did not happen lightly, and many people within the country very much opposed these restrictions. In fact, there was a lawsuit filed against Schneck versus the United States, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court, stating that it was unconstitutional for the U.S. government to restrict the basic First Amendment rights of its people. However, the Supreme Court during this time ruled in favor of the United States in this particular court case. The ruling of Schneck versus the United States is the first official true restriction of freedom of speech legally placed on the First Amendment in the United States. It says that although you have the freedom of speech and the right to say whatever you want, you lose that right if what you are saying presents a clear and present danger to society. For example, this is the ruling that prevents individuals from yelling fire in a crowded room or from saying bomb in an airport. If what you're going to say is going to be harmful towards others, you no longer have the right to say it. In addition to all of these domestic changes, the United States also had to worry about actually fighting over in Europe. Once we started sending men overseas and more supplies to be actually physically fighting the war, we began to run into more issues with the unrestricted submarine warfare that Germany had declared. Many of our ships didn't even make it over to Europe because they were attacked in the Atlantic. So the Navy began to implement a new strategic system for sending ships overseas, and this was called the convoy system, as pictured on the screen. The convoy system essentially placed the more important ships in the middle, surrounded by large battleships that could potentially fight a German submarine before it could reach the supply ship or the ship carrying all of the soldiers. As we were able to figure out how to combat unrestricted submarine warfare and send more men over to fight, it began to very heavily influence the outcome of World War I. Although in U.S. history, we don't spend a significant amount of time talking about the battles of World War I, because in all honesty, our involvement in World War I had way more impact on us domestically than it actually did the war itself. The United States' entrance in the war came at the most perfect time, because as the United States was entering the war on the side of the Allies, Russia was leaving the war, meaning Germany would no longer be faced with that second front that they would have to go and fight. Now, Russia was leaving the war because Russia was experiencing its own domestic turmoil with the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin. This Bolshevik Revolution essentially created so much internal turmoil within the country that Russia needed to focus all of its efforts and all of its energy on domestic issues rather than the war. So Russia decided to sign its own peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This treaty allowed Russia to leave the war and essentially destroyed any hopes of a two-front war for Germany to continue fighting. Initially, had the United States not gotten involved, France and Great Britain would have struggled significantly against Germany, with all of their powers being now placed on the Western Front and focused solely on taking over all of France. In fact, German troops were able to push even further into France after Russia left the war. However, American troops went in and helped resupply the French forces and tried to assist the French in holding their ground and protecting Paris from falling to German powers. At the Battle of Argonne Forest, American and French troops were able to break a hole in the German line that had been created throughout France and began to push back against the German forces. With more and more reinforcements arriving, the strength of the Allied powers, which were France, Great Britain, and the United States, was greatly now outnumbering the strength of the German forces. Within Germany, many individuals' support for the war was beginning to decrease, and on November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice. Now, an armistice is just a ceasefire, meaning they agree to stop actually fighting. Armistices, though, do not actually end wars. In fact, the only thing that can end a war is a treaty. So even though the war fighting came to an end on November 11, 1918, the war itself was not yet over. But once this armistice was signed, there were over 22 million people killed, over 20 million people wounded, and the war had already cost about $338 billion. So there was still a huge, significant global impact for this war towards the end. Once the armistice was signed, the main powers needed to come up with a plan for peace. And so in Paris, there was a peace conference that was held with an organization called the Big Four. Members of the Big Four were the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Germany was not invited to this peace conference. The lack of invitation to this peace conference created a lot of bitterness within the German government because at this peace conference, the conditions of whatever treaty would end the war were going to be created. During this peace conference, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, portrayed his views for not only the country moving forward, but the world moving forward. He had an idea of what he called peace without victory. Just because there was a winner and loser, quote unquote, in the war, doesn't mean that the winner needs to essentially gloat about it. There can be peace without really declaring a winner or a loser. Wilson wanted to eliminate the causes of war, spread democracy and self-determination, and create an organization that would work for peace to prevent any type of wars in the future. He outlined these desires in a document called Wilson's 14 Points. As soon as Wilson proposed these 14 points, the other members of the Big Four essentially laughed in his face. The 14 points were outright rejected by the Allied powers because they believed that Germany needed to suffer for their actions during the war. After the direct rejection of Wilson's 14 points because they were too lenient towards Germany and too idealistic for the time period, the other three powers created the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 is what officially ended World War I. Under the Treaty of Versailles, 9 new countries were created. All of these countries were taken over, or territories that were taken over by Germany during the war. The conditions outlined in the Treaty of Versailles were extremely harsh on Germany, causing a lot of long-term resentment and hatred. First, the treaty stripped Germany of its ability to have a military. Germany was no longer allowed to have any armed forces. It took away all of Germany's colonial possessions around the globe and redistributed them to the Allied powers. It forced Germany to pay $33 billion in war reparations to the Allied powers. War reparations are essentially damages or payments for the damages of war. But the most insulting part of the Treaty of Versailles was that it included a clause called the War Guilt Clause. The War Guilt Clause forced Germany to admit that it was responsible for the outbreak of World War I and for all of the devastation caused by it. Now, this caused the most problem with Germany because, technically speaking, Germany did not start World War I. World War I started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. However, World War I grew significantly because of Germany's involvement, but still, the War Guilt Clause caused a huge amount of resentment towards other European nations from Germans. The only avenue of the Treaty of Versailles that looked anything like Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was the creation of a League of Nations. Many of the Allied powers agreed with Wilson that an international organization was needed to ensure the peace for the future. So it still did create that League of Nations. Once the Treaty of Versailles was outlined and created, the United States rejected the treaty. We ended up creating our own treaty with Germany, ending our part of, or our involvement of the war, World War I with them. We didn't like how harsh the Treaty of Versailles was. However, Great Britain and France still forced Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and it was supposed to be the treaty and the war to end all wars for the future. However, it left many unresolved issues throughout Europe. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles is what leads Adolf Hitler to begin to write about his anger towards Europe and about German power, and it really creates an avenue for Adolf Hitler to rise to power in Germany during the time. There were many different changes because of World War I. The United States emerged with many new technologies because of our efforts in the war. There were many advancements added to tanks. We realized very early on that tanks in the battlefield, if a bullet hit a tire, the tank was then useless. So there was the introduction of steel caterpillar treads so that bullets would essentially bounce off of these quote-unquote tires and allow tanks to continue moving. During the war, the airplane was created and invented as well. Originally, airplanes were used as scouting or spying devices. However, towards the end of the war, they began to strap bombs to the bottom of the airplanes and use them as actual weapons as well. In addition to bomber planes, we see the expansion of the use of the machine gun. We see the introduction of poison gas used in warfare, which we realize very quickly how deadly and how detrimental the use of these technologies could be. And we also start to see the emergence of new hazards of war as well. Because of the style of the fighting, disease ran rampant throughout World War I. In fact, many men caught a disease called trench foot, which is essentially a bacterial infection like gangrene that kind of ate away at healthy tissue, causing many different amputations. And we start to see an acknowledgement of a trend called soldiers being shell-shocked, which would be the equivalent today to the acknowledgement of soldiers coming home with PTSD. Many soldiers after World War I came home to have complete emotional and mental breakdowns. They couldn't emotionally or mentally process the just horrors and atrocities that they saw overseas at war. In addition to the growth of technology and some of the negative consequences of war, the positive consequences of World War I in the United States was that it essentially cemented the United States on the world power stage. We emerged as the greatest industrial nation in the world. Our economy flourished because of our involvement in war, and it also began to accelerate many different social changes. In fact, it is very influential in getting the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote passed because of women's efforts in the war. Many more African Americans were serving in different avenues of the workforce because of the war as well. However, it did increase anti-immigrant feelings that were already very much present throughout the United States. Those nativist feelings, however, were now being targeted to one specific group of people, and that was Eastern Europeans, more specifically communists. We see the emergence of the first Red Scare in the United States after World War I. The Red Scare is a period of fear of communist revolutions happening within the United States. And this fear emerged directly out of the Bolshevik Revolution that happened in Russia during the war. We saw firsthand what happened to the Russian government with the fall of the government because of the Bolshevik Revolution, and people, especially government figures in the United States, were very fearful of that coming home with soldiers or emerging with immigrants. So communists and Eastern Europeans were generally associated with disloyalty. This increased the amount of usage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts that we talked about earlier, which was essentially all for nationalism and promoting America, and saying negative things would get you in trouble. But we also see the emergence of a new organization within the United States called the FBI. The FBI was originally headed by J. Edgar Hoover, and one of the main reasons for the creation of the FBI was to hunt out communists within the country. J. Edgar Hoover began to institute a set of investigations that became known as the Palmer Raids, which were essentially search and seizure investigations to find communists and remove them from the country. We wanted absolutely no inkling of communism in the United States, as we feared that it would infiltrate the government and destroy the country. In 1920, when war was officially over, Warren G. Harding ran for president on the platform of returning the country to normalcy. He wanted to make America feel safe again and wanted to return to the simple times pre-World War I era. Most American people felt the same, and so he was elected president, and American people wanted to put all of the tensions of war behind them and move forward and kind of gain momentum with a lot of the economic successes that the war had brought. Overall, World War I created a huge power shift in the globe in favor of the United States. The United States remained on top economically, politically, and socially because we didn't have to recover or rebuild from the war, and we were able to remain a global superpower.